Ruthie had no idea she'd been given the wrong key until she woke up to the smell of cinnamon coffee and a man's quiet humming in the next room. She blinked slowly. For a moment she thought she was back in her little cottage in Pine Grove, that maybe the wedding weekend had been a dream, and she'd overslept on a regular Saturday morning. But the scent was too rich, too luxurious. There was nutmeg in the air, and the sheets beneath her felt like buttered cotton. She sat up. The room was bigger than she remembered. Dark wooden beams stretched across the ceiling, and there was a framed map of old Savannah over the fireplace. The lace curtains on the tall window fluttered from a breeze. A faint humming drifted in again, soft, low, and distinctly male. Ruthie's heart hiccuped. The last thing she recalled was checking into the boutique hotel around 10 p.m., dragging her floral suitcase across the creaky lobby tile and smiling politely at the young receptionist. Lainey, that was her name. Or Lainey. She'd seemed new, sweet, nervous. Ruthie had followed her directions to the third-floor room, 314, and the brass key had clicked open the lock just fine. The hallway was dim, the floral carpet old but charming, and she was too tired to question anything. She hadn't turned on the lights. She'd simply collapsed into bed. And now someone was cooking. She swung her legs over the edge, wincing as the wooden floor creaked. She was still in her old cotton nightgown, the one with the faded blue roses and a small tear near the hem. The kind you didn't wear in company, especially not company that made cinnamon waffles and hummed like Sam Cooke. "Okay," she whispered to herself, "don't panic. Maybe it's room service." But she already knew better. She stood slowly smoothing her gown, padding toward the half-open door that led into the living room area. That's when she saw him. A tall man with rolled-up sleeves, a white dress shirt dusted lightly with flour at the elbow. His back was to her. He stood at the small kitchen counter, flipping waffles with ease, a kettle steaming behind him. Earbuds in, moving to his own rhythm, and on the side table a breakfast tray already set for two. Ruthie's breath caught. He turned at just the right moment, caught her eyes before either of them could brace. There was a pause. She noticed the tattoo peeking beneath his cuff. Not something aggressive, more like a quiet symbol, faded and intricate. He blinked, then pulled out one earbud, eyebrows lifting. "Well," he said, voice rich like the coffee. "Good morning. I think I'm in the wrong room," Ruthie murmured, clutching the sleeve of her gown like armor. "I think you are," he replied. No edge in his tone, just a quiet amusement. "But you slept well?" She blinked. "Yes, surprisingly well." "Then maybe it's not the worst mistake," he said, gesturing toward the breakfast. Hungry. She should have said no, should have apologized, should have grabbed her things and backed out the door with every ounce of small-town dignity she had left. But the scent was warm and welcoming, and the man, well, he didn't look angry, just calm, maybe even amused. "I suppose," she said, stepping inside cautiously, "it's impolite to refuse Southern hospitality." "Exactly," he said, placing a plate onto the tray. "And I make a mean waffle." Ruthie eased into the tufted armchair by the small round table, as if it might vanish beneath her. The plate set before her was elegant, but simple gold-rimmed china, a stack of waffles glistening with syrup, and a cup of coffee that already smelled like trust. Across from her, the man poured himself a second cup. "This syrup," he said casually, "is from a little farm just outside Athens. You taste the difference." Ruthie took a bite, cautious at first, but the moment the waffle touched her tongue, her shoulders dropped. Cinnamon brown sugar and something earthy. Georgia pecan. "I'll admit," she said, "this is dangerous. I might not leave." He smiled. Not the kind of smile people flashed when trying to impress, but the kind that just lived on the edges of someone's face. Warm and resting. "I'm Elliot, by the way," he said, taking a sip of coffee. "Ruthie." "Nice to meet you, Ruthie of room 314. She flushed, laughing under her breath. "Please tell me you're not some creep who collects lost guests for breakfast." "Only if they're quiet sleepers," he deadpanned. That earned a chuckle from her, a real one, not the polite kind she used back home at library board meetings. There was something absurd about all of this. She, Ruthie James Pine Grove's least adventurous librarian, sitting barefoot in a stranger's hotel suite, eating waffles made by a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a GQ cover and had somehow escaped the glare of the world. She took another sip of coffee, the heat grounding her. Then she remembered. The key. The girl at the front desk, Lainey. She must have given me the wrong room. Elliot nodded, wiping his hands with a dish towel. I was out when you came in, I assume. Door sticks sometimes. I don't usually lock it unless I'm sleeping. Ruthie's brows furrowed. You don't lock your door? He shrugged. Top floor. Whole floor's mine for the weekend. Didn't expect company. A beat passed. That must be nice, she said, then regretted the comment immediately. What did she mean? Niece to rent out an entire floor, to be the kind of person who could... But Elliot didn't flinch. He just tilted his head, studying her with a kind of gentle curiosity. It's quiet, he said. And this city Savannah's always been good at reminding me who I used to be. She didn't ask what he meant. The way he said it sounded like a closed book with a ribbon slipped inside. Instead, she glanced toward the window. The soft morning light stretched over the hardwood floor, and outside magnolia trees swayed lazily in the breeze. There was a kind of stillness here, like time hadn't quite woken up yet. Is it your first time here? He asked. She nodded. My niece is getting married tomorrow. Big church wedding. 3-day ordeal. I'm the aunt who always sends the check and skips the party. But this time, I came. He smiled gently. So you're already braver than you were last year. She blinked at that. The truth was, she didn't know why she'd really said yes. Maybe it was the way her niece had pleaded, or the silence that had begun to grow too loud back in Pine Grove. Maybe it was just time. Elliot leaned against the counter, arms folded. Well, Ruthie, you survived a night in a stranger's bed and made it to breakfast. I'd call that a win. She laughed again, softer this time. Is this normal for you? No. But I'm trying to let the abnormal be okay. Ruthie leaned back in her chair, letting the last bite of waffle settle on her tongue. She hadn't planned for this kind of morning, certainly not one that involved linen napkins and a man who smelled faintly of bergamot and old bookstores. So, what do you do, Elliot? She asked, trying to sound casual. He paused before answering, reaching for his coffee again. These days, as little as possible. She raised a brow. I used to run a company. Tech-adjacent, noise-canceling systems, smart home stuff. He waved vaguely with his mug, then set it down. Sold it. Spent the next year learning how to be quiet again. There was no boast in his voice, no self-importance. Just honesty, and maybe a little weariness. Must have been loud, she said. Elliot nodded slowly. Divorced last spring. The press had a field day. I needed out. Savannah is where I hide when I don't want to be anybody. Ruthie looked at him differently then. Not with pity, but with something softer. She knew about escape, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind. The kind where you shrink your life down small enough so nothing can bruise you. Pine Grove doesn't have paparazzi, she offered with a smile. He smiled back. Tempting. There was a silence that felt like a held breath, not awkward, but suspended, like they were standing at the edge of something neither of them quite named. Then Elliot straightened, glancing at the old clock on the mantel. We should probably call the front desk before Lainey panics. Oh, she won't, Ruthie said, quickly standing. She probably hasn't realized yet. Elliot was already dialing. A moment later, he handed her the phone. Better to explain it in your voice. You seem gentler. Ruthie accepted the receiver, chuckling. Translation, I won't yell. Exactly. She spoke briefly to Lainey, who gasped and apologized at least 5 times. Ruthie reassured her everything was fine, more than fine, and that she'd be happy to move to the correct room now. When she hung up, Elliot was waiting by the door, with her suitcase already wheeled out and upright. You didn't have to. I figured you'd want to leave with some grace, he said, smiling faintly, before I convince you to stay for lunch. She paused at that, fingers wrapping around the handle of the case. The hallway outside was empty, morning sunlight stretching through the old leaded glass. The doorframe felt like a border, But just before she crossed it, she stopped. I didn't plan to wake up in a story, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But thank you for not making me feel like a mistake. Elliot looked at her, really looked, and something unreadable flickered in his eyes. Not surprise, not amusement, something closer to recognition. He rested a hand on the doorframe, mirroring her stance. The morning light framed his shoulders, and the white fabric of his shirt caught the gold just enough to blur the line between stranger and something else. You weren't a mistake, Ruthie. She didn't answer right away. The warmth of his words pressed somewhere unexpected behind her ribs. The kind of warmth that made you question whether you really had been living or just passing time politely. Behind them, the room still smelled like syrup and comfort, like memory. She glanced down at her suitcase, then up at him again. You sure you don't collect guests like this all the time? Elliot laughed gently. I'll admit you're my first. Lucky me. Or me, he said, voice low. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ruthie stepped over the threshold, her fingers grazing the brass door handle. She didn't look back, but she didn't rush either. Halfway down the hall, Lainey appeared from the elevator, flustered and breathless. Miss James, I'm so sorry. I double-checked the reservation, and there was a mix-up with the room numbers. It's okay, Ruthie said, offering a smile that was more real than anything she'd worn in months. It was the best mistake I've had in years. Lainey blinked. Really? They walked together toward the correct room, 3 on 12. The key fit this time, and the room, while smaller, had the same old beams and creaky floors, but it didn't smell like waffles, or cinnamon, or him. Ruthie unpacked, slowly placing her books on the nightstand and smoothing out her extra dress on the bed. Through the window, the sounds of Savannah woke up bikes on cobblestone, soft jazz spilling from a corner cafe. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, and then 3 soft knocks. She opened the door without thinking. Elliot stood there, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a little to-go bag. I thought you might want seconds, he said. Or just company. She didn't say a word, just tilted her head slightly. If you ever want breakfast again, knock first. Or don't. I might leave the door open. By evening, Ruthie thought she'd shaken off the morning. The waffles, the wrong room, the slow-burning charm of a man who made breakfast like a ritual and spoke like someone who had once been too famous to speak at all. She'd promised herself not to read too much into it. It was a one-off, a Savannah mishap wrapped in maple syrup and southern politeness. Nothing more. She stood before the mirror in her hotel room, smoothing the navy blue dress over her hips. The fabric was soft and surprisingly flattering, cinching just enough at the waist without asking her to be someone she wasn't. Naomi had insisted she needed something presentable, but still very you and Ruthie had caved mostly to avoid the guilt trip monologue that always came with Naomi's wardrobe interventions. The vintage shop Elliot had recommended felt like something out of a movie, lace gloves, beaded clutches, and a clerk who called her darlin', like it was sacred. Ruthie hadn't seen him again after the suggestion, but the shopkeeper had handed her a little receipt with a note scribbled at the bottom. For Ruthie. Already taken care of. She'd almost marched right back to the 3rd floor. Almost. Instead, she'd slipped into the dress and whispered a thank you to no one in particular. The rehearsal dinner was held at a riverside restaurant that had been a cotton warehouse a century ago. Brick walls, soft jazz playing under strings of cafe lights, and the scent of fried shrimp and bourbon glaze filled the warm spring air. A breeze stirred the river, and fairy lights tangled in the trees above the patio. Ruthie stepped out of the cab and exhaled, telling herself to enjoy this. For her niece, for the memories, not for any man. And then she walked in and saw Elliot seated next to the bride. For a moment the room spun slower, like the needle on an old record drifting. He was laughing, his profile lit by the golden haze of the setting sun, head tilted back just slightly. Not the stiff kind of laugh people gave at polite events, but the real kind. The kind she had heard that morning over cinnamon steam and the scrape of a fork. Her first instinct was to backpedal right into the night, but Naomi materialized beside her, slipping a glass of iced tea into her hand. Don't even think about it, she said sotto voce. You look too good to be a runaway. I'm not running, Ruthie murmured, just assessing the exits. The South is small, babe, Naomi whispered. Trouble finds you faster than mail. Ruthie sighed, took a sip, and made herself walk farther in. She caught Elliot's eye across the room. He blinked once like resetting a camera. Then he smiled. Not the public kind, but something softer just for her. He didn't wave or beckon. Just that smile acknowledging the morning, and the dress, and the fact that the world sometimes looped in funny little circles. Naomi guided Ruthie toward their assigned table, conveniently far enough from the bridal party for plausible deniability, yet close enough to observe every interaction. The iced tea in Ruthie's hand trembled just slightly as they passed Elliot's end of the table. He was in deep conversation with Micah the groom, his expression animated but composed. So Naomi whispered as she helped Ruthie into her seat. Are we talking about him now, or after dessert? Not talking at all, Ruthie replied quickly, focusing on the menu. He's Micah's friend, that's all. And you're just ignoring that he bought your dress. I didn't ask him to. He just did it. Naomi lifted a brow. I've had men buy me drinks. Never a hem-stitched 1950s navy dress with a square neckline. Ruthie rolled her eyes, but couldn't stop the tiny curl of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Her fingers brushed the beaded clutch in her lap, as if it might anchor her. Dinner unfolded slowly with the relaxed grace only southern evenings knew how to offer. Plates of shrimp and grits made their way around the room, the scent of warm cornbread and brown butter hanging heavy. Ruthie made conversation with the woman, to her right, a teacher from Savannah, who'd once taken a pottery class in Pine Grove, where Ruthie lived. The world was nothing if not circular. Then midway through the pecan pie course, Elliot excused himself from the bridal table and stepped out onto the balcony. He didn't look back, but Ruthie felt the motion like a tide pulling. Naomi nudged her under the table. If you don't go, she whispered, I swear I will drag you out there and pretend you're sleepwalking. Ruthie didn't answer, just set her fork down carefully and stood. Outside, the balcony was lit only by the reflection of cafe lights strung above and the silver sliver of moon hanging just above the river. Elliot stood with his hands in his pockets, shoulders easy like he belonged in the hush. She cleared her throat gently. So, you know Micah. Elliot glanced over, surprised but not startled. We've worked together for years, invested in his first eco-real estate venture. And the bride, first time meeting her. She's lovely. Seems to like organizing people. She does, Ruthie said with a faint smile. She used to color-code her Halloween candy. Elliot laughed softly. You know, I wasn't sure you'd come tonight. I wasn't sure either. He turned to face her fully now. You look. She held up a hand. Don't say nice. He grinned. I was going to say stunning. But if you prefer formidable librarian with a mysterious past, I can work with that. The wind curled around them, warm and floral. Somewhere inside, a saxophone began the opening notes of Georgia on My Mind. Ruthie leaned against the railing, watching the slow shimmer of water below. I still don't know how I ended up in your room. Elliot smiled, resting an elbow beside her. I've been asking myself the same question all day. Maybe it wasn't a mistake. She glanced at him skeptical. It was Lainey, the receptionist. She's new, a little frazzled. Well, if she ever needs a raise, tell her I said thanks. Ruthie let out a soft laugh, the kind that escaped before she could guard it. Is this what you do now? Flatter strangers into staying for breakfast? Only the ones who sleep like they trust the universe, Elliot said. You didn't even check the room. I was tired, I noticed. There was something gentle in his voice, unhurried, deliberate. Ruthie looked away before the warmth could reach her cheeks. They stood in silence for a moment. The kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. Down below, a small boat passed, trailing faint music and the scent of grilled peaches. I used to come to Savannah with my mom, Ruthie said quietly. Just the two of us. Before, she didn't finish. She didn't have to. Elliot nodded slowly. You two must have been close. She taught me to love stories. and silence, and asking good questions. I like that he said, especially the part about silence. Ruthie smiled, brushing an invisible thread from her dress. What about you? What brings a man like you here, incognito, renting out an entire hotel floor? Elliot's jaw shifted slightly. Needed space. Some quiet. After the noise. The divorce. Yeah. The headlines were louder than the marriage ever was. Ruthie blinked. I didn't mean to pry. You didn't. He looked at her. Really looked. You just listen like someone who's never in a hurry. She didn't know what to say to that. So she didn't. A moment later, a small hand tugged gently at the edge of Ruthie's dress. She turned and saw a little girl around 10 with curls tied back by a satin ribbon. Miss Reader. Ruthie blinked. Lana. The girl beamed. You used to read to us at Pine Grove Library on Tuesdays. You did the voices. Ruthie laughed soft and delighted. That was years ago. Lana nodded solemnly. You made Charlotte's Web sound like magic. I'm honored. The girl skipped off back toward the tables, leaving Elliot standing with one eyebrow raised. Miss Reader. Ruthie's cheeks turned pink. It's what the kids used to call me. I did story hour on my lunch break. Elliot's voice dropped lower, warm as the river air. You belong in every room you step into, Ruthie. Even this one. She looked up at him, startled by the sincerity. The moment held quiet, full, and something more. Inside, a burst of laughter broke the spell, and Naomi leaned into view from the glass door, signaling her with a grin and raised brows. Ruthie gave Naomi a tiny wave, then turned back toward Elliot, her voice softer. You're good at this. At what? Making things feel easy. Like this isn't strange. Elliot gave a modest shrug. I've had practice making strange things feel normal. Comes with hiding from the tabloids. She gave a quiet smile, then stood straighter. Well, thank you. For the dress recommendation. And for not outing me this morning as a trespasser. That wouldn't have been very southern of me. No, it wouldn't, she agreed. And you're more southern than I expected. I grew up in Asheville. But Savannah's got more charm in a single cobblestone than most cities do in their whole zip code. They stood in companionable silence again, the kind that settles between two people who haven't figured each other out, but want to. Eventually, Elliot gave a half smile. Would it be presumptuous to ask if you're free tomorrow afternoon? I hear the hotel's garden has excellent iced tea and mediocre scones. Ruthie hesitated. He caught it. Too forward. No, she said slowly. It's just, I don't usually move this fast. You didn't? He said. You slept in my room and still didn't tell me your last name. That's because I figured you'd look it up. He grinned. I might, but I'd rather hear it from you. Before she could answer, Naomi's voice floated through the air like a conspiratorial breeze. There you are, she said, stepping onto the balcony, with the easy grace of someone who'd been watching from behind a curtain. Dessert's over and people are starting to gossip. I figured I'd rescue you both before someone assumes an elopement. Elliot chuckled. Appreciate the save. Naomi turned to Ruthie and whispered, You know what? I see. A man who's trying real hard not to stare at a woman who doesn't think she's visible. Ruthie blinked, then turned just enough to see Elliot's eyes still gently fixed on her. She felt something shift like a quiet click inside her ribs. Not quite a beginning, but no longer just an accident either. Ruthie didn't expect drama at a wedding rehearsal, but someone else had plans and a grudge. The bar was dimly lit, all amber glow, and smooth jazz with old framed wedding photos lining the exposed brick walls. A long wooden table stretched through the center, scattered with half-empty glasses of sweet tea and pecan pie crumbs. The energy buzzed soft and warm until it didn't. It started as a whisper, a low murmur at the far end of the room near the bar, taps where two women leaned in too close, phones clutched like gossip grenades. Then it rippled. Subtle at first, quiet shifts in posture, raised eyebrows, heads tilting toward glowing screens. One of the groomsmen's wives even let out a sharp gasp before quickly covering her mouth. Ruthie, still nursing her iced tea, caught Naomi's glance across the table. The look was unmistakable. Something happened. She leaned over. What's going on? Naomi frowned. I don't know. But it's got a scent. Ruthie's stomach tightened. She followed the murmurs as they moved through the room, like perfume sweet at first, then cloying. Then she heard it. His wife walked away with nothing. Bought off the media, didn't he? Elliot Rhodes. That Elliot Rhodes. A pause, then one name spoken with venom. Marianne. Ruthie froze. She turned slowly toward the source of the voice, a woman in her 40s with perfectly pinned curls and a sequined clutch seated too close to the groom's cousin. Her voice wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. Every word was sharp, intentional, meant to land. She deserved better than a settlement and a silence clause. Ruthie's breath hitched. No, she thought. Not here. Not now. She scanned the room for Elliot. There by the end of the bar, talking to the groom, his profile composed but his shoulders slightly tenser than usual. He hadn't heard it yet. Or maybe he had, and was pretending not to. Ruthie felt something sour rise in her throat. This wasn't just awkward. This was deliberate. The woman speaking, she wasn't family. Ruthie remembered her from the seating chart earlier, old college friend of the groom. Someone who once pitched a business idea that never got funded. Naomi leaned in again, voice low. That's Claire. Heard she's been itching for payback ever since Elliot turned down her startup last year. And this is her payback. Naomi nodded grimly. Well-timed scandal and a cheap cocktail. Classic Southern theater. Ruthie set her glass down harder than intended. She stood smoothing her dress and took a breath that barely made it down her chest. Then she walked out. The night air outside hit her like a wave of relief, cool, still smelling faintly of river mist and jasmine vines that curled along the wrought iron railing. Ruthie stepped onto the quiet sidewalk, heels clicking softly against brick pavers as she walked toward a small bench under an old gaslight. She sat, exhaled, and rubbed her palms together, trying to steady her breath. She wasn't angry, not quite, but something in her chest itched, a weight pressing against ribs already worn thin from years of cautious trust. She'd known this weekend would stir things. Weddings always did, but she didn't expect to feel foolish. The door behind her creaked open. Footsteps, then silence just long enough to make her heart beat louder. I should have told you before anyone else could. Elliot's voice was calm, tired but without self-pity. Just fact. Ruthie didn't turn around right away. She stared at the cobblestones beneath her shoes, the way shadows fell between each groove like folded secrets. You knew it was coming. He sat beside her, careful to leave space. Not too far, not too close. I knew Claire had a grudge. I didn't know she'd carry it to someone else's rehearsal dinner. Ruthie finally looked at him. But the rest? Was it true? Elliot met her gaze, head-on, eyes quiet. Partly. Depends on which headline you read. I don't read tabloids. Good, he said. Then maybe you'll let me explain before deciding I'm every version of me that's ever been printed. She didn't answer right away. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers knotted tightly. Elliot waited, not pushing. After a long pause, she asked, You left your wife with nothing? No, he said softly. She left with peace. That was all she wanted. And the clause, he exhaled through his nose. She asked for it. Not because I wanted to silence her, because she didn't want the circus anymore. I offered her more. She refused. Said it was the only way we'd both be free. And you didn't fight it. He looked out at the gaslight flickering above them. I fought everything else for years. The lawyers, the press, the looks at restaurants. But not her. Marianne and I, we stopped being married long before the world knew it. We just didn't stop being headlines. His voice cracked slightly, but he kept it together. Ruthie felt something in her jaw soften, but she wasn't ready yet. Why didn't you say anything this morning? She asked. Went over waffles and syrup? He gave a dry laugh. Ruthie, I didn't think I'd see you again. And even if I did, I wanted to be just a guy who liked cinnamon, not the one you'd Google and flinch away from. Her throat tightened. I don't flinch. No, he said gently. You freeze, then walk away. That landed hard. She stood slowly, smoothing her skirt, trying to gather the pieces of herself he'd just seen too clearly. I need a moment, not a fairy tale, just some air. Then she turned heels, echoing down the quiet sidewalk as Elliot remained seated beneath the gaslight, watching, waiting, not chasing. Not this time. Back in the hallway of the hotel's third floor, Ruthie pressed the heel of her hand against her chest. The keycard trembled slightly between her fingers as she paused in front of room 312, her real room. The number stared back at her like it had all along, unchanged, uncomplicated, and unmistakably hers. She stepped inside. Cool air greeted her. The curtains were drawn, catching the light from a nearby street lamp that flickered through the sheer linen. Everything was quiet except for the low hum of the antique mini-fridge in the corner. She closed the door softly behind her and leaned against it, breathing in the scent of lavender sachets placed thoughtfully under the pillows by housekeeping. It was supposed to be calming, but her thoughts refused to settle. She hadn't meant to run, but that's what it felt like. As if she'd slipped out before things got complicated, before kindness became expectation. Ruthie sat on the edge of the bed and toed off her shoes. The soft cotton of her dress rustled as she shifted to reach for her suitcase, intending to distract distance. Then she saw it. At the foot of the door, a brown paper bag neatly folded at the top, resting gently against the wall. She hadn't noticed it when she walked in. She stared at it for a long moment, unsure if she should open it. But curiosity, or maybe something quieter hope, nudged her forward. Ruthie reached for the bag and brought it to the bed. She unfolded the top carefully, like unwrapping something fragile. Inside, her navy blue dress, freshly cleaned, pressed, folded with almost reverent care, and on top of the fabric a small white card. Her fingers hesitated before picking it up. Simple handwriting, ink slightly smudged like someone had written it quickly, then changed their mind and smoothed it down anyway. I'd still buy it again. E.R. No apologies, no explanations, just a gesture. Something in her chest pulled tight, then loosened. She pressed the card between her palms, closed her eyes, and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Elliot hadn't chased her. He hadn't tried to fix it. But he had remembered. That was worse somehow. And better. Much better. She stood, walked over to the closet, and hung the dress carefully next to the robe the hotel had provided. The card she slipped into the front pocket of her journal on the nightstand. She sat back down and reached for the glass of water beside her bed, her fingers brushing against the condensation. Her mind replayed the night, not the whispers or the scandal, but Elliot's face under the gaslight. The way he hadn't looked ashamed, just honest. And the way he'd seen her, you freeze then walk away. He wasn't wrong. She curled her legs under the comforter, the journal still in her lap, the pen uncapped beside her. The page was blank, but her fingers traced the edge of it, like she might write something soon. Maybe not tonight, but maybe. Outside, the late-night air had settled into a heavy quiet, interrupted only by the distant hum of a streetcar and the occasional bark of laughter from nearby bars winding down. Inside room 312, Ruthie sat cross-legged on the bed, thumbing through her journal with no intention to write. Not yet. She let the pen rest on her thigh, her eyes drawn instead to the navy blue dress now hanging by the window. It swayed ever so slightly in the breeze, from the vent above the motion, subtle, like it still remembered the curve of her body from the night before. She smiled faintly. And then she shook her head, because it was ridiculous getting sentimental over a dress. Over a man she'd known for 36 hours. But still, he hadn't tried to explain his way out of the gossip, hadn't told her to ignore it, hadn't tried to chase the narrative or her. He'd simply left space and a clean dress. That was the part that got her, because she'd spent years around men who loved noise, who'd fight to be right louder and longer than necessary, who made silence feel like punishment. But this was quiet in the kindest way. Ruthie reached again for the card and read it one more time under the amber glow of the bedside lamp. I'd still buy it again. E.R. Her thumb traced the initials. Not just Elliot. Elliot Rhodes, the billionaire, the headline, the man she'd accidentally met because someone mixed up a key. She turned the card over, blank on the back. No phone number, no pressure, just presence. A soft knock startled her. 3 gentle taps. She blinked, unsure if she imagined it, then rose slowly, padding toward the door. The hallway was quiet, no footsteps fading, no voices. She opened it just a crack. No one stood there. But at her feet another small surprise. This time not a dress, not a card. A simple paper takeout box tied with twine, still warm to the touch, resting atop a folded napkin. She crouched and lifted the lid. Inside, a single piece of warm pecan pie. No note, no name. But she knew. She stood there for a moment, holding the box, feeling the weight of something unspoken bloom gently behind her ribs. And as she stepped back inside, closing the door softly behind her, a question tiptoed through her thoughts. What if kindness wasn't a trick? What if this time it was real? She turned just enough to see Elliot's eyes still gently fixed on her. She felt something shift, like a quiet click inside her ribs. Not quite a beginning, but no longer just an accident either. Elliot didn't knock. He just sat outside her door with 2 cups of coffee and waited until Ruthie opened it, one hesitant inch at a time. The hallway of the boutique hotel still smelled faintly of jasmine and old wood polish. The morning sun filtered through the transom window, casting warm, shifting rectangles on the floor. Ruthie, in an oversized cardigan and yesterday's cautious heart, peered out like a woman deciding whether to welcome memory or shut it out for good. I brought peace offerings, Elliot said softly, raising the coffee cups. One's got cream, the other doesn't. I flipped a coin. She didn't smile, not quite, but she opened the door wider and stepped aside without a word. Elliot moved slowly, respectfully, setting the cups down on the small writing desk by the window. The room was cozy, sunlit, exactly the kind of quiet place that felt like her. He didn't sit until she did. She chose the armchair. He took the window ledge. You sat out there long, she asked finally, voice even, but not cold. A while, he admitted. Didn't want to press the bell? You looked like you needed quiet last night. Ruthie picked up the cup with cream. He smiled, almost proud of himself. I read your note, she said. I figured. Did you expect a thank you? No, he replied. I hope for a conversation. A pause. Then she sighed. Why didn't you tell me sooner? About everything. Elliot leaned back slightly, gaze never leaving her. Because I liked who I was around you before all that had a name, and I didn't want to ruin that too soon. That's dangerous. I know, but I also knew if I waited too long, I'd lose the right to tell you myself. Ruthie sipped her coffee slowly, as if tasting his words. I'm not a tabloid reader, she said. But that message last night, the one about your ex-wife and the settlement, it hit me. I imagined it might, he said gently. And I kept wondering if I was just another version of a story already told. You're not, Elliot said, with a firmness that surprised even him. You're the first person who didn't look at me and see a dollar sign, or a scandal, or a fixer-upper. You just saw a man who makes waffles badly and leaves the door unlocked. The corners of her lips twitched, a crack in the stone. He let the silence stretch. It was her turn to speak if she wanted. And when she finally did, it came out quieter than he expected. What's with the coffee and waiting? Elliot shrugged lightly. I figured if I couldn't talk my way into your trust, I'd sit still long enough for you to know I wouldn't walk away. Ruthie stared at him. That's either the most manipulative or the kindest thing anyone's ever done, she muttered. I'll take either, but I'm aiming for kind. She laughed, then just a breath, but it was enough. I'm going to the wedding, she said suddenly, as if testing the idea aloud. Naomi's already texted me 3 outfit options and a playlist. Good, Elliot replied. You'll like the ceremony. They've got jasmine vines wrapped around the arches. She arched an eyebrow. You're not trying to sit beside me, are you? No, he said. But I'll be around, in case you want another coffee. They sat for a moment longer, watching the sunlight catch on the rim of their cups. Then Ruthie asked, You really bought that dress back? Had it cleaned and folded? Elliot grinned. I have resources, and you use them for dry cleaning. I used them for you. Ruthie didn't respond. But when he stood to go, she walked him to the door. She didn't say goodbye, but she also didn't close the door right away. And Elliot took that, like the coffee, like the silence, as something sacred, something beginning. Savannah on a Sunday morning felt like a whispered hymn. Cobblestone streets warmed by sun, the distant toll of a church bell, and the soft rustle of Spanish moss above the square. Ruthie stepped carefully across the stone path near Wright Square, her heels low, her dress simple, her heart unsure. Beside her, Naomi adjusted the strap of her purse and glanced sideways. "You okay?" "I'm not okay," Ruthie said, managing a dry half-smile. "That's progress." Naomi nodded. "You know what I see." "What?" "A woman walking beside a man who isn't even here, but somehow he's walking right with her." Ruthie blinked at the image. "That's not poetic. That's creepy." They both laughed, the kind that was half therapy, half release. They crossed into the courtyard cafe, nestled between brick buildings and shaded by tall oaks. Tables were dressed in white linen. Waiters moved like dancers, balancing trays of iced tea, peach scones, and warm biscuits. And there he was, Elliot. He stood up as they approached, dressed simply but sharply. No suit, just a chambray shirt rolled at the sleeves and khakis, with a watch that looked worn, not flashy. His smile met her before his words did. "Ruthie," he said gently, like it was both a greeting and a hope. She gave a small nod, standing, while Naomi slipped away with a smirk and the grace of a woman who knew when to disappear. "I ordered ahead," Elliot said. "They have lemon blueberry scones. The good kind." "Is there a bad kind?" He tilted his head. "Yes, the dry kind. You deserve better." She rolled her eyes, but her smile stayed this time. They sat. As the coffee was poured and the food arrived, he didn't fill the air. He let her lead. She noticed that, and after a few careful bites and a sip of iced tea, she said quietly, "Tell me about the rooms." He looked up. "The rooms. You mentioned something about naming them." Elliot leaned back, folding his napkin slowly. "Yeah, my mom ran a little bed and breakfast in Asheville. Rustic, warm, 2 porches. Each room had a theme: lavender morning, magnolia view, that sort of thing." Ruthie stirred her spoon. "Sounds sweet." It was. After she passed, I kept it in the family, but we let it sit for a while. I wasn't ready. But lately I've been thinking about reopening it, with new names. She looked up. New names. For women who changed something in me, who reminded me of something I'd forgotten. People who were kind when they didn't have to be. Ruthie hesitated. "Like your mom. Like her. And like you." The pause between them wasn't silence. It was reverence. "You were going to name one after me?" she asked, barely above a whisper. He nodded. "I still am." Ruthie's quiet room. Her breath caught in her throat. "You're not loud," he continued. "You don't demand a room. But somehow, when you're in one, it gets softer. Safer." Ruthie didn't know what to say. So she reached for her glass and whispered, "That's unfairly sweet. I have my moments." They sat like that for a while, finishing the meal slowly. When it came time to go, Ruthie stood and said, "I'm still not promising anything. I know, but I'll walk with you to the wedding." His eyes crinkled. "Even better." They stepped into the late morning light, their steps slow, not quite synchronized, but steady. Not a couple. Not yet. But a woman and a man walking side by side toward something neither of them had planned and neither of them wanted to leave behind. The wedding unfolded like something from a southern folktale, live oaks, heavy with moss jasmine twining through white trellises and string lights swaying softly in the afternoon breeze. The guests murmured like a low tide, their conversations gentle, respectful of the beauty surrounding them. Ruthie stood near the outer edge of the garden ceremony, her navy dress catching the filtered sun, the silk clinging to her like a second kind of hesitation. She had come with Elliot, but didn't sit with him. That had been her choice. Across the aisle near the second row, Elliot waited quietly. He didn't glance around or fidget. He simply looked ahead, hands clasped, face thoughtful. But every few moments, only when he thought no one noticed, his eyes found hers. Ruthie never looked back too long, but she always met his gaze. The bride and groom stood under a floral arch of ivory roses, and jasmine, their vows delivered in hushed emotion. Ruthie felt her own chest rise and fall with the rhythm of their words, her hand grazing the card Lana had slipped into her clutch earlier that morning. She had found the little girl waiting outside the cafe, a hand-drawn card in her hands. Miss Reader Lana had said proudly, "I made this for you, because you read stories that stay in my head." Inside was a crayon drawing of a girl sitting under a tree, reading to animals. Above it, in uneven letters, "Thank you for the voice in my head." Ruthie had smiled, knelt, and hugged her. Now, during the ceremony, her fingers brushed over that same folded note, grounding her. Naomi leaned over and whispered, "You good?" "I'm thinking about voices," Ruthie replied. "Whose?" "Mine," she said, "and the ones I never thought anyone listened to." Naomi gave her a slow nod and murmured, "You can't outrun kindness, Ruth. It waits." Ruthie didn't answer, but her eyes flicked back to Elliot. After the ceremony, while guests slowly made their way to the reception tent under a canopy of string lights, Ruthie lingered near the edges of the garden. She noticed how Elliot didn't rush to her side. He gave her space. It wasn't an absence, it was permission. A breeze passed, lifting the hem of her dress just slightly. The smell of jasmine was almost overwhelming, sweet and persistent. She closed her eyes. She didn't want grand gestures or more complications, but she couldn't deny what she was beginning to trust. There was something rare in a man who didn't fill every silence, who let her choose. When she turned, Elliot was leaning near one of the trees, not close enough to intrude, not far enough to be dismissed. He gave her a gentle nod, then tilted his head toward the tent. She walked over slowly. "Do you know how to waltz?" he asked when she reached him. "No," she said honestly. "Neither do I." That made her laugh. "Then what's the plan?" "We fake it, or we don't dance at all. Whatever you want." She stared at him for a moment. Then instead of answering, she took the lead and stepped ahead her shoulder, just barely brushing his, as they walked toward the music. He followed, as he always had, not chasing, not retreating, just there. Later that evening, after the last slice of pecan pie had disappeared and the jazz trio had packed up their instruments, Ruthie slipped away from the reception. She needed quiet again. The streets of Savannah hummed with a gentle hush. Spanish moss hung like whispers from the trees. Ruthie walked alone, heels in hand, the night air cool on her skin, the weight of the day sitting somewhere between her chest and her memory. Back at the hotel, she stepped into the elevator, pressed the worn brass button, and leaned against the mirrored wall. Her reflection stared back with a softened gaze, a woman not quite at ease but not running either. When she reached her floor, the hallway greeted her in golden light. As she approached her door, something made her pause. A glow from her phone, a notification, one new email. No subject line, no sender name, just a short message and a single hyperlink. Curious but cautious, Ruthie stepped inside, kicked the door shut softly with her heel, and set her phone on the nightstand. She changed out of her dress, wrapped herself in the old hotel robe, and sat cross-legged on the bed. Then she opened the email. The link led to a simple blog page. White background, gray serif font. No ads, no comments, no pictures, just words. Words she knew. A room and a cup of tea. She hadn't seen that title in years. 5 years ago, after a long winter and a harder heartbreak, she had written the piece anonymously. A meditation on stillness, on choosing solitude without sadness. She had posted it under a pen name and never told a soul. Her hands trembled slightly. She scrolled to the end. There beneath the final paragraph about worn wood floors and tea that cooled too slowly, a comment had been added, dated only a few hours ago. "Thank you for the voice in my head. E.R." The blog post had been anonymous, but Elliot had remembered every word and built his future on it. Ruthie stood in the hotel lobby, her suitcase balanced neatly beside her like a quiet punctuation mark. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of the boutique inn, catching on the antique brass fixtures and polished wood floors. Everything in this place had a charm southern, slow, and deliberate. Everything except her heart, which refused to follow the rhythm. She hadn't slept much. The link in last night's email had led her to a corner of the internet she'd nearly forgotten her old blog. Just a handful of posts she'd written in quiet moments about books, about tea, about surviving invisible heartbreaks. A room and a cup of tea had been the most personal, and apparently the most read. "You ready?" Elliot's voice was low behind her, not rushed, just present. She turned, and he held up 2 takeaway cups. One was clearly hers, marked black, no sugar in Sharpie. The other had her name written below it in small, neat print. Ruthie. As if the drink was less important than the fact that he remembered. "I still don't know how you found it," she said as they stepped outside into the mild morning. The rain had passed hours ago, leaving behind a fresh scent and glistening cobblestones. "It didn't even have my name on it." He glanced over, unlocking the car with a beep. "Does it matter how I found it, if it found me first?" The drive from Savannah to Pine Grove was just over 4 hours, long enough for truce to settle in, long enough to undo silence gently. They drove in stretches of comfortable quiet. The road narrowed as city blurred into countryside, and trees arched over the pavement like guardians of a slower life. Ruthie watched the world pass, hands folded in her lap, the warmth of the coffee still lingering in her palms. "You remember what you wrote in that post?" Elliot asked, eyes on the road. "I remember writing it," she replied. "Not the exact words." "I do," he said simply. She glanced over. He reached into the glove compartment and pulled out a small device, clicked a button, and his own voice filled the car, not present day, but quieter, almost meditative. "Reading. Some rooms are loud with grief, others are quiet with grace. But the best ones, the rarest, are simply rooms where you can hear yourself breathe." Ruthie went still. Elliot let it play a few seconds longer, then shut it off. "I listened to that every night for almost 6 months," he said, hands steady on the wheel. "Back when everything else felt like static." She didn't interrupt. Her throat was too tight to trust with words. "It was just a post," she finally whispered. "It was just air," he countered, until someone gave it form. Raindrops began to appear on the windshield again, soft and slow. He switched on the wipers, not rushing. Everything he did had a rhythm, she noticed. Not for show, just for presence. "I didn't think anyone was reading those," she murmured. "I wrote them for myself, to not come undone. I read them to stay alive." She turned her face toward the window, hoping the mist outside would blur the sheen in her eyes. "You never said anything." "I didn't know how to back then. I was trying to outrun being known. Turns out the quiet found me anyway." They fell into silence again, but it was the kind that held weight, not distance. The kind that acknowledged something real had been exchanged. Outside, the green rolled in hills and old barns with peeling paint stood like relics of steadier times. When they passed the "Welcome to Pine Grove" sign, faded, hand-painted, but proud, Ruthie exhaled like she hadn't breathed the whole trip. He noticed. "Want me to drop you home?" he asked. "Actually," she said slowly, "could we stop at the library?" "The one you work at." "The one I live through," she said, half smiling. He nodded, led the way. The Pine Grove Public Library sat at the edge of town, nestled between an old post office and a bakery that still used a brick oven from 1912. The building was modest, white siding, green shutters, but it stood with quiet dignity. A porch wrapped around the front, and chimes hung from the eaves, tinkling gently in the breeze. Elliot parked the car and cut the engine. "You sure it's open?" "It doesn't have to be," Ruthie said, already stepping out. "I have a key." She led him through the side entrance, past the return book drop, and into a world that smelled like cedar and ink and 1,000 stories waiting to be remembered. Inside, soft light filtered through lace curtains. The silence was thick, but not empty. It was the kind that invited thoughts to slow down and settle. "This place—" Elliot's voice trailed off as he turned in a slow circle, taking it all in. Wooden shelves lined the walls. A row of mismatched armchairs flanked the front windows. A hand-painted sign over the main desk read, "Come as you are. Leave with more." "It used to be a grocery store," Ruthie said. "They turned it into a library in '72. My grandmother helped catalog the first collection. He wandered past a display of children's books, pausing at a section labeled Read Aloud Heroes. A faded photo was framed there, Ruthie maybe 15 years younger, holding a copy of Charlotte's Web, and surrounded by children on a rug. "That's you," he said quietly. She nodded. "Wednesday afternoons, rain or shine, some of those kids have kids now." From a shelf nearby, a soft giggle rose. They both turned. Lana, the little girl from the wedding dinner, stood in her Sunday dress, holding a worn library card and a drawing. "I told Mom I'd come back," she said proudly. "I made something for Miss Ruthie." She handed over the paper, a bookmark colored with crayons, the corners carefully trimmed with safety scissors. In the center, written in block letters, was a single sentence. "You matter to someone you'll never meet. Or maybe you already have." Ruthie's fingers curled around the bookmark like it was something sacred. Elliot bent slightly to Lana's eye level. "That's beautiful," he said. Lana beamed. "Miss Ruthie has story magic. She reads like it's real." "She does," Elliot agreed, glancing over at Ruthie. "Some of us never forgot." Lana gave a small wave, then darted off toward the picture books. Ruthie watched her go, heart full and aching at the same time. "Kids remember what kindness sounds like," Elliot said softly. Ruthie led him past the checkout counter to a small alcove, tucked between shelves, what she called the quiet nook. A single lamp, a love seat, a side table with a chipped teacup that held bookmarks instead of sugar cubes. They sat. She didn't speak first. Elliot did. "After my divorce, after the headlines and the lawyers, and the gutting silence of my house, he said I stopped talking to people. My assistant thought I was having a breakdown. I wasn't. I was empty." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper, yellowed at the edges. "You printed it?" she whispered. He nodded. "Carried it with me. Every city, every hotel." Her breath caught as he unfolded the page. Her words, typed underlined, annotated in blue ink. Whole paragraphs highlighted like scripture. "I didn't even know I needed a still place until I read about one." She closed her eyes, not from sadness, but from the enormity of grace. "You didn't know me," he added, "but you still saved me. And not with noise, with stillness." Ruthie turned to him slowly. There were no theatrics in her face, no dramatics in her breath, just a kind of reverence, like she was standing in the middle of a truth too quiet to shout and too sacred to ignore. "You didn't save me with noise. You saved me with stillness," Elliot repeated, looking down at the folded page in his lap. "That's rarer than anything I've built." He said it plainly, not as a man offering gratitude, but as someone finally naming the foundation he'd stood on all along. For a long while, neither of them moved. The air between them was rich with meaning, like the scent of old paper and time well kept. "I wrote that post," Ruthie finally said, "the night I found a photo of my mom holding a cup of tea in front of the window. She'd just been diagnosed with cancer. I felt helpless. I just wanted to believe that quiet wasn't the same as giving up." Elliot nodded, his eyes soft. "It wasn't. It was shelter." Outside, a low rumble of thunder curled across the sky, just enough to make the windows shudder faintly. Rain tapped gently against the roof, and somewhere deeper in the library, a clock chimed the half-hour. "I'm not used to being someone's reason," she whispered. "I've always been the one standing behind the curtain, making sure everyone else gets their moment." "You didn't stand behind," he said. "You stood steady, and I saw that." She looked at him, the corners of her mouth twitching upward. "You're surprisingly poetic for a man who used to own half of Midtown." "I sold the poetry first," he said deadpan. "The condos came later." Ruthie laughed, then a real one, unguarded. It lingered in the air like cinnamon. Elliot watched her carefully, like he didn't want to miss it. "You know," she said, "when I woke up in your room that first morning, I thought the universe was playing some kind of cruel joke." "Maybe it was," he said. "Or maybe it's just tired of watching good people miss each other." She didn't respond, but her gaze lingered on him longer than it had before. This time, there was no retreat behind lowered eyes, no folded arms, no protective sigh. She was simply present. He reached across the space between them, not to touch her, but to pull a thin children's book from the shelf behind. The Velveteen Rabbit. He opened to the first page, tracing the edges of the paper like someone reacquainting themselves with an old friend. "This one deserves its own room," he said quietly. Her breath caught. "You read that as a child?" He shook his head. "I read it last year." Out loud, in a room full of nothing, just to hear something honest again. "And I cried," he admitted, "alone in a $30 million townhouse." Ruthie blinked at him. "That's a terrible place to cry." "I know," he said. "That's why I left." Ruthie leaned back on the love seat, the quiet surrounding them, now feeling less like a pause and more like a homecoming. She watched Elliot close the book with care, his thumb lingering just long enough on the worn spine to suggest something unspoken. Outside, the rain had softened into mist. Through the lace curtains, Pine Grove looked hushed, wrapped in that peculiar stillness only small towns knew how to hold, like the world had momentarily exhaled and let itself be. She stood and walked toward the door of the alcove, then paused. "I didn't know those words would matter," she said without turning around. "They mattered to me," he replied simply. The stillness that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. At the front desk, she placed the handmade bookmark from Lana into the holder beside a stack of overdue slips. Then she turned back to Elliot, who stood quietly by the children's section, now holding the copy of The Velveteen Rabbit, as though it had always belonged to him. "I have to lock up," she said, not apologetically, but with the kind of softness reserved for people you want to see again. He nodded and followed her to the door. At the threshold, she hesitated, then reached for something just beyond words. "You didn't come here to thank me?" she said. "Not really." "No," he agreed. "I came because I'm ready to stop running." She studied him for a moment, her gaze steady. Then, with a quiet breath that sounded like trust stretching its limbs, after too long a sleep, she said, "Come back when you're ready to build, and bring a hammer." He smiled slow and real and stepped out into the silver morning. The door closed behind him with a soft click, but the room remained warmer than it had been, almost as if something had been left behind, not an object, but a beginning. 6 months later, nestled in the amber folds of a North Carolina autumn, the B&B opened with only 5 rooms. No fanfare, no ribbon-cutting ceremony, just an open gate, a porch light glowing softly at dusk, and the scent of cinnamon drifting from the kitchen like a promise. The most requested room wasn't the one with the fireplace or the lake view. It was the quiet one in the east wing with a blue teapot on the sill, a crocheted quilt folded neatly at the foot of the bed, and a small bronze plaque beside the door that read, "Ruthie's Quiet Room." Ruthie stood in the doorway that morning, a weekender bag slung loosely over one shoulder. The floor creaked under her as she stepped inside the worn pine planks, singing a tune of welcome. Light filtered through gauzy curtains, dancing on the shelves filled with storybooks and second-hand treasures. A tabby cat named Teacup blinked up at her from the armchair, yawned, then promptly curled back into its cushion. She exhaled. It was the first breath she'd taken in weeks that didn't feel like it had to be earned. The week before, a simple envelope had arrived at her small cottage in Pine Grove. No fancy lettering, no RSVP required. Just her name and the words, "Come see what kindness built." She'd said yes before she'd even finished her tea. Now, standing in this space stitched together with care and quiet intention, she saw traces of Elliot everywhere, but not in the way people often imagine when they think of wealthy men. There were no grand declarations, no monograms, just thoughtful gestures, a drawer filled with stationery and bookmarks, a tiny bell shaped like a rabbit on the windowsill, and a handwritten note tucked beneath a teacup that read, "I didn't build this for you. I built it because of you." Ruthie sat down on the window bench and watched leaves drift down like soft exclamation points from the trees. From the garden below, she could hear voices, laughter, a wheelbarrow squeaking, the faint hum of someone playing Ray Charles on an old radio. She'd arrived a day early to help with the finishing touches. It hadn't been part of the invitation, but Elliot had simply smiled and said, "Of course you'd want to shelve the books." He was different now, still quiet, still precise, but there was a looseness in his shoulders, a patience that no longer seemed to come from exhaustion, but from peace. He didn't hover, didn't orchestrate. He just made sure things were ready, then stepped back and let people belong. Ruthie unpacked, slowly placing her favorite mug by the sink, smoothing the pillowcases like someone preparing for a long story to be told. On the desk beside the bed sat a glass frame. Inside it, an old printout of her blog post, slightly yellowed with soft creases along the fold lines. "A Room and a Cup of Tea" by Anonymous. She laughed when she saw it, then blinked hard, then laughed again. When she opened the nightstand drawer, she found a tin of her favorite herbal blend and a pair of reading glasses that looked suspiciously like hers but weren't. Elliot had remembered the brand, just not the prescription. Later that afternoon, Ruthie walked through the B&B's narrow hallways, her fingertips grazing the reclaimed wood railings, polished to a warm sheen. Each room bore a brass plate with names like Clara's Garden, Eleanor's Nest, and the Velveteen Room. All stories, all women. Each a quiet nod to someone who had shaped Elliot's path gently and without spectacle. At the end of the west corridor, she peeked into the reading nook. A girl sat cross-legged on a floor cushion, flipping through a book with a fox on the cover. Her mother sat nearby, sipping cider, distracted by the soft ping of incoming emails on her phone. The girl looked up. "Miss Reader." Ruthie blinked, startled for a second, until she recognized the wide eyes, the gap-toothed smile, the way her voice lifted like punctuation. "Lena." The girl beamed, holding up a handmade bookmark with glittering stars. "It's me. We're staying for 2 nights. Mom says I can sleep in the treehouse loft bed." Ruthie knelt beside her, adjusting Lana's crooked pigtail. "And you've already found the best spot in the house." Lana giggled, then leaned in conspiratorially. "I told Mom you were the fairy godreader. She didn't believe me until she saw your name on the door." Ruthie chuckled. "Well, I'm not sure about the fairy part, but I do like granting book wishes." The little girl rummaged in her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of thick paper. "This is for you." On the front was a drawing of an open book with stars floating above it. Inside, in chunky pencil letters, "Thank you for the voice in my head." Ruthie pressed her palm to her chest. "That's the kindest sentence I've ever read." As Lana scampered off to chase Teacup down the hall, her mother approached her, tone hushed and a little sheepish. "She's talked about you since Savannah. We didn't know this was your place. I just thought the name sounded comforting." Ruthie smiled. "I think that's the best kind of advertising." In the evening, a soft fog rolled down from the mountains, curling over the porch like a shawl. The front yard smelled of rain-kissed pine and warm pumpkin bread. Inside, candles flickered in mason jars, and a playlist of old Southern jazz played low from the parlor speakers. Ruthie found Elliot in the conservatory adjusting a vase of wildflowers on a side table. He didn't hear her approach, not until she picked up one of the loose stems, a yellow snapdragon, and slipped it back into place. "You never liked symmetry," she said softly. He turned amused. "I don't like perfect. I like stories." Their eyes met, but neither moved closer. The space between them didn't ask to be crossed. Instead, he said, "Did Teacup give up your chair yet? She's curled in it like royalty. I wouldn't dare." They wandered through the rooms, checking pillows and matchbooks, half listening to the sound of laughter from the kitchen. As they moved, Ruthie noticed the subtle details, hand-lettered quotes on window panes, quilts, folded in perfect thirds, door hinges that didn't creak every corner, bearing the mark of someone who had taken their time. And in every hallway, fresh air, not just from the open windows, but from the sheer absence of pretension. They stopped in front of Ruthie's quiet room. She leaned against the frame. "You really didn't build this for me." "No," Elliot said. "But every time I thought of giving up, I pictured someone finding this room, finding stillness when they needed it most. And you were always in that picture." That night, the rain came in again, soft like a second layer of blankets over the hills. Ruthie curled up in the window seat of her room, the blue teapot on the sill, catching reflections from the porch light. A book lay open in her lap, but her eyes weren't reading. They were watching the candle flicker beside the framed blog post above the bed. She had nearly forgotten about that piece. It wasn't grand, Just a few hundred words about a worn armchair in her childhood home, and how her mother would make tea during storms, reminding her that quiet wasn't the absence of noise, but the presence of safety. I didn't think anyone read it, she whispered to the air as though the walls might respond. She walked to the tiny writing desk and brewed a pot of cinnamon tea. The warmth rose into the air, curling around the bookshelves and lace curtains. She poured 2 cups. The hallway creaked once. She didn't check who it was, just stepped outside and placed the second teacup on the floor by her door, like a ritual between old souls who understood the language of gestures better than declarations. In the morning, the cup was gone. A new note had been left in its place. No one ever saved me with noise. She folded it slowly, like handling old paper from a library archive, and slipped it into her coat pocket before heading downstairs. By mid-morning, Ruthie was sitting in the small community library of Brevard. Elliot had arranged for her to read during the B&B's opening weekend, a quiet nod to the beginning of their story. The children gathered on floor cushions as she flipped through the pages of The Velveteen Rabbit, her voice low and steady, holding their attention like thread through cloth. Halfway through, a small shadow appeared in the doorway. Elliot! He didn't wave, didn't say a word. He just leaned against the frame, hands in his pockets, letting the story wash over him. His eyes weren't on the book, they were on Ruthie, but not in the way one watches a performance. More like someone witnessing something sacred return to where it belonged. The story continued. Ruthie didn't break rhythm. She only smiled almost imperceptibly, then read the next line like it had always been meant for this exact moment. When the reading ended, Lana tugged on Ruthie's sleeve and whispered, "He was here the whole time." "I know," Ruthie said softly. "Why didn't he sit with you?" "Because some people don't need to be seen to be present." Lana nodded thoughtfully, then ran off to show her mother the sticker she'd earned for listening quietly. Later that afternoon, as the last guest trickled out of the library, Ruthie wandered back toward the B&B. The golden leaves crunched under her shoes, and in her hand, she held a small envelope. Lana had slipped it into her coat without a word. Inside was a child's drawing a teacup with wings sitting on a cloud. Beneath it, written in careful, uneven letters, "Thank you for the voice in my head." Back at the B&B, she found Elliot kneeling beside the garden beds, arranging small pots of mums. He looked up, brushed the dirt off his palms, and smiled, not the polished kind reserved for photo ops, but the quiet one, the one that said, "I waited, and I still am." "You don't have to do everything," Ruthie said, crouching beside him. "No," he said, pressing his thumb into the soil. "But I want to." They planted in silence after that. Not a heavy silence, but the kind that lets the heart breathe. Every so often, Elliot would glance at her hands, dirt under the nails, sweater sleeves, pushed up, and smile like he was memorizing a page he'd waited his whole life to read. That evening, just before the light faded, Ruthie brewed another pot of tea. She carried it to the quiet room and left the door ajar. A candle flickered in the window, casting soft shadows on the wall where the plaque hung beside the sill. Ruthie sat in the reading chair, a blanket around her legs, and picked up the old soft copy of The Velveteen Rabbit. Footsteps sounded down the hall. Elliot paused at the threshold. "May I?" She nodded once. He stepped inside, closing the door gently behind him. Teacup, the cat, purred from his spot on the bed, utterly unimpressed by the moment. As Ruthie read aloud, her voice steady and low, Elliot listened with the reverence of someone who knew stories could save lives. And just like that first morning months ago, no one said too much. Until a child's voice drifted in from the hallway. "Are they married?" Lana asked. Her mother chuckled, brushing the little girl's hair back gently. "No, baby," she said. "But that's not the only kind of forever. Sometimes the quietest rooms echo the loudest truths." In a world quick to judge by headlines or appearances, Ruthie and Elliot reminded us that stillness, presence, and small kindnesses can build something stronger than romance trust. When we stop trying to be seen, we start seeing each other. Like a teacup left on a windowsill unnoticed by most, the softest gestures often hold the most warmth. If this story stirred something in you, perhaps it's time to pass that warmth forward, one gentle act at a time.